Culture of New Zealand. Early Maori adapted the tropically based East Polynesian culture in line with the challenges associated with a larger and more diverse environment, eventually developing their own distinctive culture. Social organization was largely communal with families, Wenau, sub-tribes, Hapu, and tribes, Iwi, ruled by a chief, Rangatira, whose position was subject to the community's approval. The British and Irish immigrants brought aspects of their own culture to New Zealand and also influenced Maori culture, particularly with the introduction of Christianity. However, Maori still regard their allegiance to tribal groups as a vital part of their identity, and Maori kinship roles resemble those of other Polynesian peoples. More recently, American, Australian, Asian and other European cultures have exerted influence on New Zealand. Non-Maori Polynesian cultures are also apparent, with Pasifika, the world's largest Polynesian festival, now an annual event in Auckland. The largely rural life in early New Zealand led to the image of New Zealanders being rugged, industrious problem solvers. Modesty was expected and enforced through the tall poppy syndrome, where high achievers received harsh criticism. At the time, New Zealand was not known as an intellectual country. From the early 20th century until the late 1960s, Maori culture was suppressed by the attempt at assimilation of Maori into British New Zealanders. In the 1960s, as tertiary education became more available and cities expanded, urban culture began to dominate. However, rural imagery and themes are common in New Zealand's art, literature and media. New Zealand's national symbols are influenced by natural, historical, and Maori sources. The silver fern is an emblem appearing on army insignia and sporting team uniforms. Certain items of popular culture thought to be unique to New Zealand are called Cuisine. Art. New Zealand art as part of the resurgence of Maori culture. The traditional crafts of carving and weaving are now more widely practiced, and Maori artists are increasing in number and influence. Most Maori carvings feature human figures, generally with 3 fingers and either a natural-looking, detailed head or a grotesque head. Surface patterns consisting of spirals, ridges, notches and fish scales decorate most carvings. The preeminent Maori architecture consisted of carved meeting houses, werenu, decorated with symbolic carvings and illustrations. These buildings were originally designed to be constantly rebuilt, changing and adapting to different whims or needs. Maori decorated the white wood of buildings, condos and cenotes using red, a mixture of red ochre and shark fat, and black, made from soot. Paint and painted pictures of birds, reptiles and other designs on cave walls. Maori tattoos, moko, consisting of colored soot mixed with gum, were cut into the flesh with a bone chisel. Since European arrival, paintings and photographs have been dominated by landscapes, originally not as works of art but as factual portrayals of New Zealand. Portraits of Maori were also common, with early painters often portraying them as an ideal race, untainted by civilization. The country's isolation delayed the influence of European artistic trends, allowing local artists to develop their own distinctive style of regionalism. During the 1960s and 1970s, many artists combined traditional Maori and Western techniques, creating unique art forms. New Zealand art and craft has gradually achieved an international audience, with exhibitions in the Venice Biennale in 2001 and the Paradise Now exhibition in New York in 2004. Refer to caption Portrait of Juniper of Gatika by Gottfried Landauer, showing Shinmoko, Taunamu Tiki and woven cloak. Maori cloaks are made of fine flax fiber and patterned with black, red and white triangles, diamonds and other geometric shapes. Greenstone was fashioned into earrings and necklaces, with the most well-known design being the Hitiki, a distorted human figure sitting cross-legged with its head tilted to the side. Europeans brought English fashion etiquette to New Zealand, and until the 1950s most people dressed up for social occasions. Standards have since relaxed and New Zealand fashion has received a reputation for being casual, practical and lackluster. However, the local fashion industry has grown significantly since 2000, doubling exports and increasing from a handful to about 50 established labels, with some labels gaining international recognition. Literature New Zealand literature Maori quickly adopted writing as a means of sharing ideas, and many of their oral stories and poems were converted to the written form. Most early English literature was obtained from Britain, and it was not until the 1950s, when local publishing outlets increased that New Zealand literature started to become widely known. Although still largely influenced by global trends, modernism, and events, the Great Depression, writers in the 1930s began to develop stories increasingly focused on their experiences in New Zealand. During this period, literature changed from a journalistic activity to a more academic pursuit. Participation in the World Wars gave some New Zealand writers a new perspective on New Zealand culture, and with a post-war expansion of universities, local literature flourished. Dunedin is a UNESCO City of Literature. Media and entertainment. New Zealand music has been influenced by blues, jazz, country, rock and roll and hip-hop, with many of these genres given a unique New Zealand interpretation. Maori developed traditional chants and songs from their ancient Southeast Asian origins, and after centuries of isolation, created a unique, monotonous, and doleful sound. Flutes and trumpets were used as musical instruments or as signaling devices during war or special occasions. Early settlers brought over their ethnic music, with brass bands and choral music being popular, and musicians began touring New Zealand in the 1860s. Pipe bands became widespread during the early 20th century. The New Zealand recording industry began to develop from 1940 onwards, and many New Zealand musicians have obtained success in Britain and the United States. Some artists release Maori language songs, and the Maori tradition, based part of Kapahaka, song and dance, has made a resurgence. The New Zealand Music Awards are held annually by Recorded Music NZ. The awards were first held in 1965 by Reckitt and Coleman as the Cuisine Golden Disc Awards. Recorded Music NZ also publishes the country's official weekly record charts. Hills within set, round doors, reflected in water. The Hobbiton movie set, located near Matamata, was used for the Lord of the Rings film trilogy. Public radio was introduced in New Zealand in 1922. A state-owned television service began in 1960. Deregulation in the 1980s saw a sudden increase in the numbers of radio and television stations. New Zealand television primarily broadcasts American and British programming, along with many Australian and local shows. The number of New Zealand films significantly increased during the 1970s. In 1978, the New Zealand Film Commission started assisting local filmmakers, and many films attained a world audience, some receiving international acknowledgement. The highest-grossing New Zealand films are Hunt for the Wilder People, Boy, The World's Fastest Indian, Whale Rider, Once Were Warriors and The Piano. The country's diverse scenery and compact size, plus government incentives, have encouraged some producers to shoot very big-budget and well-known productions in New Zealand, including The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit film trilogies, Avatar, The Chronicles of Narnia, King Kong, Wolverine and The Last Samurai. The New Zealand media industry is dominated by a small number of companies, most of which are foreign-owned, although the state retains ownership of some television and radio stations. Since 1994, Freedom House has consistently ranked New Zealand's press freedom in the top 20, with the 19th freest media as of 2015. Sport in New Zealand rugby team wearing all black, facing the camera, knees bent, and facing toward a team wearing white haka, performed by the National Rugby Union team, All Blacks, before a game. The haka is a challenge, with vigorous movements and stamping of the feet. Most of the major sporting codes played in New Zealand have British origins. Rugby union is considered the national sport and attracts the most spectators. Golf, netball, tennis and cricket have the highest rates of adult participation, while netball, rugby union and football, soccer are particularly popular among young people. Horse racing is one of the most popular spectator sports in New Zealand and was part of the rugby racing and beer subculture during the 1960s. Around 54% of New Zealand adolescents participate in sports for their school. Victorious rugby tours to Australia and the United Kingdom in the late 1880s and the early 1900s played an early role in instilling a national identity. Maori participation in European sports was particularly evident in rugby, and the country's team performs a haka, a traditional Maori challenge, before international matches. New Zealand is known for its extreme sports, adventure tourism and strong mountaineering tradition, as seen in the success of notable New Zealander Sir Edmund Hillary. Other outdoor pursuits such as cycling, fishing, swimming, running, tramping, canoeing, hunting, snow sports, surfing and sailing are also popular. New Zealand has seen regular sailing success in the America's Cup Regatta since 1995. The Polynesian sport of waka ama racing has experienced a resurgence of interest in New Zealand since the 1980s. New Zealand has competitive international teams in rugby union, rugby league, netball, cricket, softball, and sailing. New Zealand participated at the Summer Olympics in 1908 and 1912 as a joint team with Australia, before first participating on its own in 1920. The country has ranked highly on a medals to population ratio at recent games. The All Blacks, the national rugby union team, are the most successful in the history of international rugby and have won the World Cup 3 times. Cuisine New Zealand cuisine raw meat and vegetables ingredients to be prepared for a hangi. The national cuisine has been described as Pacific Rim, incorporating the native Maori